Since the 19th century, the US government has intervened to combat the growth of monopolies in our economy. The stakes in these interventions are high. Without government oversight, monopolies can stifle competition and raise prices for Americans. But with excessive intervention, the government can also damage the economy by preventing companies from growing and innovating. This has led to an ongoing debate on the best strategy for regulating mergers. When should the government stop two companies from joining forces to prevent economic domination and the suppression of competition? When should the government step back and let companies combine their resources to promote growth and innovate on a larger scale? Over the years, there have been shifts in policy in how aggressively the government intervenes, and we are at a crossroads today, where the policy may shift again. But first, what is the Federal Trade Commission, and where does its role in oversight come from? Hello, I'm Paul Ray. I'm the director of the Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation, and for a couple of years I had the privilege of serving as the administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, the central regulatory hub of the federal government. OIRA, as it's known, reviews hundreds of regulations every year. I'm here to speak with you about some of the most pressing regulatory issues confronting our country today.
The Federal Trade Commission is an agency. It's made up of 5 political appointees. It's a commission, and they decide basically what's fair and unfair in the economy, in trade. They have 2 very, very broad directives. They look at business practices and they say, these are unfair, we're gonna stop them. And the other main part of the FTC's mission is about regulating monopolies and stopping consolidation in businesses and antitrust.
The Federal Trade Commission is responsible for directing a large part of the economy. There are regulated sectors that other regulatory agencies deal with, the Food and Drug Administration, the Department of Transportation, and so on. But for the economy as a whole, the Federal Trade Commission has an awful lot of responsibility for making sure that the free market works for the benefit of the economy as a whole, and in particular, consumers.
In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the government became concerned that newly industrialized companies were becoming so powerful that they threatened the existence of free enterprise. The government responded by passing a series of laws to prevent companies from monopolizing. These laws were the Sherman Act, the Clayton Act, and the Federal Trade Commission Act.
The Sherman Act makes it illegal to monopolize, attempt to monopolize, or combine or conspire to monopolize. Now that includes by mergers. So if one company buys enough other companies in the same industry to become a monopoly, that's forbidden by the Sherman Act of 1890. In 1914, Congress decided it wanted a stricter anti-merger law.
In 1914, Congress passed the Clayton Act and the Federal Trade Commission Act. Now, the FTC Act, as you might imagine, set up the FTC, and the Clayton Act was a law that had a lot of different parts, but the major part of it was it prohibited certain kinds of mergers, certain types of consolidation of businesses, and it said the FTC is the agency that is supposed to enforce this.
As time went by, companies tested the boundaries of these laws, and this led lawmakers to respond with adjustments that made them stronger. The 1950 Clayton Act amendment eventually led to the 1963 Philadelphia National Bank Supreme Court case, which the FTC won. This led to the incipiency doctrine.
After the 1950 expansion of the Clayton Act, I think there was a little feeling out period, but there were some cases that went to the Supreme Court, and the court really adopted a very expansive view of the law. And that was really, in a lot of ways, the high point. I mean, that case basically said, look, if the agency doesn't like it, they can stop it.
That's become known as the incipiency standard. The legislative history of the Clayton Act says we want to stop mergers in their incipiency. We want to block mergers before they get anywhere near becoming a monopoly. And the courts had said sometimes a corporation can do that with as little as 60% of a market. But the Supreme Court said, we're not requiring a 60% combined market share. If the market share exceeds 30% of the market, that's at least a presumption that the merger should be stopped. So you could say the Philadelphia National Bank presumption is the embodiment of the incipiency idea.
In 1968, the FTC released the first of what it called its merger guidelines. These guidelines were not legally binding, but they were intended to serve as a roadmap for expanding companies that wanted to avoid trouble with the FTC.
The FTC really designed its current enforcement practice and philosophy in the 1960s. And this is a document that they call guidance. They say this is not a rule, this isn't the law, you don't have to follow it. But this is a set of things that we're gonna look at, and we're gonna use this to decide what's an okay merger, what's not okay. And I think through that measure, the commission started enforcing it very aggressively. They started blocking lots of mergers. And then there is a period in the 1970s and 1980s where I think the courts were really staking out a much narrower view of the agency's authority.
The judiciary now is a lot more conservative than it was in 1963. And all of these terms are kind of squishy. So that means their enforcement depends on the philosophy of the enforcers at the Federal Trade Commission and, of course, the judges who make the ultimate decision. As the enforcers get more conservative, they bring fewer cases. So they interpret these words in a more conservative direction. They're much less likely to find that a particular merger is likely to lead to a monopoly than were most of the judges in 1963.
Today, the FTC is at a crossroads. Its current chair, Lina Khan, has been vocal about her plans to move the agency back to more aggressive enforcement, maybe even renewing the incipiency doctrine of the mid-20th century. Her concern? That a permissive approach to business regulation runs the risk of allowing businesses to become too powerful and too politically influential.
Significant market consolidation deprives consumers, workers, and independent businesses of choice, further enabling dominant firms to engage in unfair practices. As the wave of privacy abuses in recent years has shown, market dominance often allows companies to renege on commitments, evade the law, and repeatedly violate commission orders.
Ultimately, questions about the FTC's role and power lead back to questions about the proper roles of Congress and the agencies, about the balance between the delegation of power for efficiency's sake and the ever-present concern that agency use of this power may not reflect the will of the people.
At a really basic level, antitrust law is really a question about who is supposed to make the right decisions or the important decisions. And our Constitution gives us a very clear answer that major policy decisions, rules for the economy, how we operate, those are all supposed to be written by Congress. So the argument I hear all the time when I talk about, well, Congress should really write laws instead of agencies, people say, well, that's not practical. Congress never does anything. But this is a chicken or the egg kind of a question. Congress doesn't pass laws because they don't have to, because agencies do that for them. They're used to that. And the only way to stop that is to impose limits on the agencies and to say, no, you can't write all the laws anymore. That's not your job. And yes, in some instances, it might cause trouble and there might be problems, but that's the only way to get Congress to do its job in the first place.
I don't want judges to be going through the wilds of economics and voting with their gut as to whether they like this merger, whether they don't like this merger. I'd rather they restrain themselves, cabin their own discretion, and then maybe the judges will actually follow the intent of Congress in 1914. So that's why we're suggesting changes in the merger guidelines. I am very much opposed to giving federal judges open-ended discretion. I would much rather their discretion be cabined, and one way to cabin that discretion is to tell the federal judges that the best way to implement the statute that Congress passed in 1914 is through the Philadelphia National Bank presumption. I think that's the way the need for resilient redundancy should be implemented. I want to lower the discretion of the enforcers and also lower the discretion of the federal judges. And in this way, it'll get us back to the intent of Congress when it passed the Clayton Act.
Time will tell what answers the FTC will give to some of the questions we've debated today and what the next phase of antitrust enforcement will look like.